Okay, over to you, Swati.
Thank you, Dina, so much for this opportunity, and I'm honored to have this opportunity. And the theme of this year, transformations and transition, is something very intriguing for, I'm sure, all the environmentalists and other scholars in environment and legal theory. So, hello everyone. I'm Swati Singh Parmar. I teach international legal theory and history at Dharmshastra National Law University, Jabalpur, in India. And today I'm excited to talk about something that's been really close to my heart of late. It is, uh, let me share the slides. It is Cartesian Detachment, Crafting of Development and Coloniality as the Fault Lines in Environment Law. So I hope my screen is visible to all. Okay. So to begin with, I would like to start with one anecdote. So in our school time, when we used to read the poems by European scholars like P.B. Shelley on daffodils, cherry blossoms, and how beautiful is spring, I could not much relate to it because for us in India, spring sometimes meant mud or leaky roofs or some devastation, and not as romantic as springs are portrayed in Bollywood or Hollywood. And that the same issue I felt when I was understanding environment law. I thought that I found myself to be very much detached from environment law because I could not see environment law and its discourse constructed by someone in different context than I as a reader in totally different detached context. And that made me evaluate, critically see the foundations of environment law, and which is why this theme of today's discussion. So with that, I wanted to make a point that how much important context can be for a reader or the audience. And sometimes it may be very difficult for the reader or audience to connect to the literature that has been produced out of context of that reader. And this is very much true for international environmental law because although we have a very dense network of environmental law regimes globally, regionally, and state-wise, but then theoretical discussions on philosophy of international environmental law has been quite scant. So in today's discussion, I'll talk about introduction. I'll introduce briefly what the issue is, and then I'll mention my primary objectives of this discussion. Then I'll discuss about coloniality and subservience of environment. Then I'll move to Cartesian revolution and detachment from the environment, and then head on to rise of positivism and centering development. And then I'll try to summarize, if I have time, of whatever we have discussed so far. So to give a brief introduction, so we all are aware of the number of conventions, treaty arrangements, institutional arrangements, frameworks, funds, programs out inside United Nations network and outside. So at international level, at regional level, and domestic level. But then still there is something fundamentally flawed with how we address our environmental concerns. And this fundamental flaw is not only at global level, but also has permeated to the domestic levels. And this fundamental flaw I see lying within the fold of philosophy of international environment law, something which has been completely alienated by international lawyers, legal philosophers, practitioners, teachers, everyone. And this also has been highlighted by few scholars like Coyle and Karen Morrow in their work, The Philosophical Foundations of Environmental Law, Property, Rights, and Nature. Note that ignored philosophy of international environment law is one of the reasons why legal regimes of international environment law are seen as mere set of facts. And once they're seen as mere set of facts, they are accepted as it is in a very positivist construct of it, and not critically evaluated well as other regimes of law are. Now, this brings us to the primary objective of our discussion today. So, I would try to share with you an analysis of major events and processes that happened around the long 19th century in Europe, and how all these processes hijacked the environmental debates and infused capitalism, utilitarianism, economic dividends, and developmental imperatives in these debates of environment law. So I'll talk about four main tangents on showing the fault lines of environment law. And these are four prominent decisive events, in my understanding, that entirely changed the perception of environment law and how we look at it. And these tangents continue to dominate our understanding of environment law even today. So first one is subservience of environment on the rationality of utility. So this is the economic, capitalist, and pecuniary rationale about environment and how environment can be used for capitalist goals. And this is something which was infused by coloniality, but has been sustained and retained by the post-colonial states as well. Second tangent is the portrayal of compelling need of development. Now, in this, I'll talk about how industrialization in Europe created this compelling need that development is the most important human concern. Third tangent is rise of positivism, the analytical positivism, that furthered and conditioned the ideas of development. And fourth, I'll discuss about Rene Descartes, who's a French mathematician and a philosopher who created a detachment that I'll talk about in detail in my next slides, and that is commonly known as Cartesian detachment. So talking about the first, yes. So coming to the first line of argument about subservience of environment and how this was created by the colonial regimes and the idea of imperialism itself. So with this, with the end of era of Renaissance and the beginning of Age of Enlightenment in the Europe, impetus was given to modern science and technology, where modern science was prioritized over everything else. And in this prioritization, naming of nature, especially taxonomizing of nature, was given a prime importance. And in this global epistemological conception, plant species from colonial explorations were catalogued in honor of white men from Western culture. Therefore, this sequencing of scientific societies, which was taxonomizing of flora and fauna, was created by the West. Example, how in all the non-European states also we continue to depend on Latin trinomials in botany, zoology, and other science-driven subjects. Now, all these developments aided in portrayal of European travelers, which otherwise were seen as travelers in maybe the Silk Route or other areas of globe in pursuance of trade. Now, the same European travelers were portrayed as scientific classifiers who are doing something in their philanthropic zeal for humankind or mankind on the lines of scientific development. And one of the scholars on Mary Louise Pratt, she's a scholar on linguistics, language, and new coloniality. She notes the dissemination of imperial philosophy within the power frameworks of formal colonial rule had a far-reaching effect on the environment of the colonies. So this the imperial philosophy had scientific development and scheme of scientific societies at its pivot, and this was furthered through the powerful frameworks of colonialism, something which has not enough been highlighted by the scholars on coloniality. Now, again, I'll take example from one of the articles. This is titled "Ordering the World for Europe: Science and as Intelligence and Information as Seen from the Northern Periphery." So I'll read out the first line of the article after the abstract. It notes the growth of Western global domination from the Renaissance to the 19th century was as much a scientific process as an economic and military one. So, otherwise, in the conventional cliche understanding of coloniality, it's seen attached to economic and military sense, but not attached to the scientific zeals of imperialism and colonialism. And and if we move forward, coming to peculiar examples of how colonialism interacted with environment. So there's series of scholars like Vandana Shiva, Richard Grove, John Mackenzie, who have shown the very intrinsic relationship shared between colonialism and environmental degradation in their works like Globalism, Biodiversity, and the Third World by Vandana Shiva, Richard Grove's work on conservation and colonial expansion, and John Mackenzie's work on the empire of nature. And these colonial practices had different kinds and layers of environmental degradations effect on different colonies. Now, and specifically, the native ecosystem was destroyed many folds by legal as well as political policies by the colonial rulers. And these included overuse of land, overuse of human resources, overuse of animals, other natural resources. This also has been pointed out by one of the scholars, R.P. Tucker, in his work, The British Colonial System and the Forests of Western Himalayas, 1815 to 1914. Similar work has been done by Prakash Kumar. This is the cover of the book, where he talks about indigo farming and science in colonial India. Now, all these examples I'm sharing to make a point about how this Western colonial productivist point of view of the colonial regimes saw indigenous farmers and their small scale scattered farming as hurdles or as something erratic farming. And therefore, clearly crafted policies were made by the colonial rulers for plantation of specific species. And these selection of specific species was on the scales of capitalism. And the yields of these plantation were carefully monitored by the colonial regimes, and their tracks of where they'll be imported and exported was very closely monitored on the scales of capitalism. And this popularized, and in a very uncritical way, the misuse of indigeneity, indigenous people, indigenous ecosystems, and others for the goals of scientific inquiry. So most of the selected species plantation was justified on scientific development goals. This also has been pointed out by one of the scholars, Rebecca Saucy, in her work, Indigenous Peoples and Epistemic Injustice. Now, besides this, so I'll talk about few examples. So this is again an example of how colonialism interacted with the subservience of environment in the colonies. So this is an example of palm oil and the farming of palms, which was popularized in Malaysia, Indonesia, and other East Asian states, and also some African states. So if anyone has flown over Indonesia or Malaysia, in the flight, there's clear-cut thousands and thousands acres of land with dense palm oil trees and no other plantation, something which is very evident even from that height. So I'll give example of this blog post from Monga Bay. It is written by Victoria Snyder. And it is titled How the Legacy of Colonialism Built a Palm Oil Empire. And I'll read the relevant paragraphs here. She notes, under the guise of a philanthropic mission to stimulate trade and provide humanitarian assistance for the indigenous population in Central Africa, Leopold had succeeded in convincing other European countries to entrust the Congo to him as his private property in 1885. His agenda to turn Belgium into a colonial power through the extraction of natural resources by means of a forced labor system and land expropriation was only revealed years later. While colonial rule was flourishing all over Africa, Leopold's government in the Congo basin was committing atrocities against the indigenous population, which comprised most of the labor force for resource extraction. If rubber collection quotas were not met, punishment could include kidnapping, the severing of hands, and murder. Demographers estimate that by the end of Leopold's reign, the population had decreased by around 10 million people. So, this is just one example of the policies, the political or the legal policies that were created by the colonial regimes outside the in the non-European world on pressurizing the small-scale farmers, indigenous populations in a certain category of plantation only. So this is an example of palm oils. We have similar examples in wild rice. So this is another example of how the plantation and popularizing the plantation of wild rice. So this popularizing is not only popularizing but also compelling. So how the compulsions that were casted on colonial regimes around Britain for plantation of wild rice created an entire shift in the climate in those colonies. So this is an example from another article, Inured to Empire, Wild Rice and Climate Change. Now the relevant lines that are highlighted in yellow, like to read out to you. In Britain, providing rye, oats, barley, and buckwheat to the poor and to laborers and workmen would reserve domestic wheat for export. In Quebec and other northern colonies, wild rice would feed colonists in frontier settlements, reducing their dependence on imported provisions. Again, if wild rice were duly cultivated, this is the local and indigenous farmers compelled to cultivate only wild rice. So if wild rice were duly cultivated like white rice, Britain might have rice from other northern as well as our southern colonies. So, and there are tons of such examples for colonialism and environmental degradation in plantations of palm oil outside East Asia also. So palm oil plantation in Ghana, cotton, rubber, gum, and copal plantation in Ghana. Then there's similar examples of pressurized monoculture plantation of rubber in Vietnam by the French rulers. And similar horrifying stories are of Indian indigo, which was used by the cloth manufacturers in Italy, France, and Britain. And if we see the data, so back in 1788, the out of the total share of indigo used by the cloth manufacturers, Indian indigo comprised 30% of it. But then by 1810, Indian indigo comprised 95% of the total indigo used by cloth manufacturers in the Western states. And there are horrifying stories about Indian indigo and how Bengal region in India was pressurized for it, and how it is found to be closely linked with the Bengal famine, which is a historical, I think, one of the largest man-made human catastrophes in the history of India. Now, also another example from Haiti, where the floods in Haiti in the 18th century were uh, empirically found to be a result of forced deforestation by the French colonialist in Haiti. And all these forms of colonial practices, so these examples are not stranded examples of certain events, but these also tell you a framework of imperial idea about environment, about that environment can be used and misused, and about the fact that sustenance of environment or protection of environment is something which is artificially created by legal regimes now, but still the imperial ideas about how environment can be treated finds the way in the legal regimes today to surpass those. Now, if we move to the second line of argument about Cartesian revolution and detachment from the environment. So there's one scholar from whom this word Cartesian is derived. This is Rene Descartes, who was a staunch French mathematician, a scientist, and later a philosopher. In one of his works titled Discourse on Method, published in 1637, he talked about a lot of radical things. So he talked in part 5 of the book, he argued that the body is basically a machine and the soul is not a machine. So if an entity, a biological entity has body, that itself does not make that biological entity as human, but the soul has to be there. So by these arguments, he drew parallels between animals and machines. So he compared animals to machines, where he said that animals are mindless brutes. They do have body which appears to be similar in functioning to that of humans. So they do have body, they have body functioning, they have organs, but all this is maybe similar to human body, but then they don't have a soul, or they don't have uh, mind enough to actually control humans, and therefore animals are as good as machines or mindless brutes. He noted that animals are just sheer bodies without souls and without minds, and therefore it's as good as to treat them as pure machines. And thereby he argued that animals are devoid of any moral standing. Now, this argument, incapability of moral standing of animals, led to a shift in thinking from uh, the internal within the human beings and the external. And this created a divide between human beings as distinct, separate entity from the world surrounding them, the world that is external to human beings. And although he is eulogized to have added ideas of certainty and clarity on in human thought by making this distinction, he's also credited to have brought a shift in thinking from blind faith to skepticism. But then his argument that animals are brutes and it is perfectly fine to use animals and therefore also misuse them because they don't have any moral standing, brought very interesting shift in environmental law discourse. So this incapability of moral standing offered a justification, and this justification was used as a right, now not a moral right but also a legal right, by the humankind to use animal for the human interests. And this also brought a shift from the earlier existing Greek view and Renaissance view about nature, where nature was seen as part of human and not detached from human. So this idea that human is detached from environment and therefore it is justified to use environment as and when human needs is also known as Cartesian detachment, as popularized by uh, Descartes. And this Cartesian detachment, along with other things, did three things pivotal to environmental law discourse. First is the centrality of human element. Second is normalizing the use and therefore the misuse of natural environment, including plants, animals, for human benefit. Third is non-questioning of unnatural treatment of the nature. And these all these things uh, are the elements that dominate the legal regimes across the globe on environment law. The Descartes detachment, the Cartesian detachment, dominated human thought uh, around 17th century and later. And the legal frameworks created on protection of environment law around 17th century and after that, they also espouse this sharp distinction of human and environment. So this debate grew to be human versus environment, where there were human advocates, but there was no environment advocate. And this erected a sense of detachment and constructed artificial objectivity that environment is different. And all this also created a difference in how the approach and intention of moral, legal, and political agendas were in relation to environmental protection. So, for example, if we talk about environment impact analysis, which is a mandate uh, to be complied with for any new establishment to take place, how these are seen merely as compliance. So, how most of the mandates related to environment in third world states are seen as mere tick boxes or mere mandates which are to be cosmetically complied to, while there's no real intention to actually think about environment and environmental protection. So, so moving to the next, the third and fourth tangents that I've combined as one because they're intrinsically uh, attached to each other. So one is rise of positivism and another is centering of development. So rise of positivism along this 19th century, it created an emphasis on empirical analysis of law as it is and not as it ought to be. And therefore, it also emphasized the detachment of law from moral, ethical, and other concerns. It paved way for admiration of logical consistency by the positivist and even others. And this, in a way, exploited the normative, substantial, and capitalist choices in international environmental law. So now the choices in international environmental law, which still was a native, normative, and developing stage, were driven by the ideas of modernity and development and not about environment. So environment had taken a back seat and modernity and development were the drivers of almost all the debates of international environmental law. Now, we as a human society, we prioritized economic interest over morality, justice, or any other political or ethical considerations. Also, during the same time, the idea of development was being crafted. And it came to be eulogized as the most significant dimension and identifier of human existence, where elements like happiness, uh, as something as neutral, something as natural a feeling as happiness, was attached to material happiness or capital happiness. And therefore, the neutrality of science, that science is an amoral entity. So neutrality and amorality of science was borrowed to craft the idea of development in a very logical sounding setting. And therefore, we all created the delusion of sustainable development. So there are scholars who've pointed out the flaws in the nomenclature itself, how sustainable development is pivoted around development and not around environment. So though sustainability is there, but it exists as a veil over the pivot of development. So now, with the delusion of this sustainable development that we all collectively created, we have put development at the center and environment at the periphery. Though sustainable development is otherwise seen as the most cherished child of international environment law. And thereby, by the nomenclature itself, we have this portrayal that development has to take place that suits the environment and not environment has to be there that suits the development and not casting an imperative on development that suits the environment. So it is the opposite way as it should not have been. And all the concerns of environment now are trimmed and shrimped to meet the developmental standards. And this also brought a diabolic shift in human adjustment, from human adjustment to environment adjustment. So otherwise humans were seen to be adjusting to with the environment. Now that, because of Cartesian detachment along with rise of positivism and idea of development, now it was environment which had to be adjusted and not the humans. So this, I wanted to share this cover page of a magazine printed by Inland Printers in 1901 from London. And this shows how the idea of development was being casted in the Europe back then. So the cover page shows two magicians. And so here is a magician who's clothed in Asian clothing, and with this, which we know as Aladdin's Chirag. And, and in the background, there are some Asian structures. And here we have written Oriental. And then there's a stark, sharp cut here where we see an Occidental, who's dressed with gumboots and instruments. And then we have this Eiffel Tower of Paris, skyscrapers, this bridge, huge water ships. So all these as symbols of development, industrial development, and capitalist developments. So this was portrayed to tell that how now the Europeans, the age of industrial development and advancement was glorified and fancied. And while the Orient was still in their not so sharp cut edge buildings or not scientific developments as these skyscrapers, these water ships, these gadgets, the rail track on which he's resting his arm. And it's not about this magazine only, but other media's scholarly text and debates that casted and eulogized that development is the only way out and development is the most important ingredient attached to the quality of life. So right to life as a human right was very much attached to technological advancement and development. Now, if we take another example of Convention on Biological Diversity and access and benefit sharing system within it. So access and benefit sharing system is built on the rationale of potential value of genetic resources. So again, it is the potential capitalist value of genetic resources and not about protection of genetic resources or protection of genetic resources against capitalist goals. And thereby, ABS incentivizes the states to conserve their biological resources. George Cabrera has noted on access benefit sharing system that the roots of ABS can be traced to colonialism and efforts by colonial powers to gain control of the trade in key commodities such as rubber, tea, and cinchona for their benefit, with little regard for the communities and economies from which these resources originated. Now, this otherwise the idea of environment protection, which was seen as altruist, uh, because other without a political will, it was only altruist, did not have a legal mandate. In this backdrop, the idea of sustainable development gained lot of popularity and political prominence, because this was comforting for the political will also that espoused and furthered the capitalist goals. One of the scholars notes on sustainable development that how sustainable development was a smoke screen put up by business and development interest to obscure the conflicts between ecological integrity and economic growth, and between the interests of the rich north and the poor south. So sustainable development was now being popularized as something which is very scientific, economic, Western, and something which everyone should look up to. Though the fact was clear that it was deduced from the compulsions of industrialized induced development, or uh, imperial induced ideas about development. So the imperial idea that that created a scale of civilization, civilized, uncivilized. This was now uh, this was now replaced by a scale of development. So now the same scale of civilization on the civilized end was the developed, and on the uncivilized end was the undeveloped or underdeveloped or developing. So the words civilized replacing the developed, being replaced by the developed, and uncivilized being replaced by underdeveloped or developing, is something which has not been problematized enough by scholars in developmental sciences, in economics, in law, and even in environment. So again, the scale of development that we are developed and others are not is created by the North, and the compulsion that everyone has to be judged on the scale of development is devised by the North, despite the lack of representation of the South in most of the conventions and regimes created on international environment law. So, to summarize, I've tried to underscore the need to study this deeply seated North and South divide in international environment law, uh, by showcasing how the Cartesian detachment led to the distinction of human element from the rest of the environment, thereby justifying the use of environment for human goals. And then, secondly, by crafting of the idea of development in the backdrop of rise of positivism and coloniality. So the Western detachment of human element from environment I see as a fault line, because it creates a juxtaposition of human concerns with the environment. Also, the colonial interactions with the environment in their colonies left a very far-reaching impressions, which continue to be sustained and cherished by the colonies now, uh, in the way they approach environment law. So the examples of the corruption in environmental related mandates or surpassing of environment related mandates are extremely high in frequency in the post-colonial states than in the North, something that bears the imprints of imperial understanding of environment. So I'll wind up there, and I'm happy to take questions, suggestions, feedback. Thank you so much for patience listening.
Thank you, Swati. What I'm going to do is just stop the recording